Forget everything you think you know about Jamaica's economic future. While many might picture a laid-back island, a quiet revolution is underway that could see it surpass Singapore's economic might within the next 15 years. We unpack the surprising strategies and unexpected sectors driving this monumental shift. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by economic transformations and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button. We're on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Now, let's explore how Jamaica is rewriting its destiny. When you mention Jamaica and Singapore in the same sentence, most people would laugh. Singapore, the gleaming city-state with its spotless streets, towering skyscrapers, and one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. Jamaica, the island of reggae, beaches, and a reputation that often overshadows its true potential. But what if I told you that beneath the surface, Jamaica is positioning itself for an economic leap that could fundamentally reshape global perceptions of what's possible for developing nations? This isn't about blind optimism or wishful thinking. This is about recognizing patterns, understanding global shifts, and seeing what happens when a nation decides to harness every ounce of its potential. Jamaica's story is one of redemption, resilience, and strategic reinvention. For too long, the narrative has been written by outsiders who see only what's on the surface. But the real story, the one unfolding right now in boardrooms in Kingston, in tech hubs sprouting across the island, and in the minds of a determined generation, is far more compelling. Let's rewind for a moment. Jamaica's history is complex. Like many Caribbean nations, it carries the weight of colonialism, the scars of economic exploitation, and decades of structural challenges that seemed insurmountable. For years after independence in 1962, Jamaica struggled with debt, political instability, and an economy heavily dependent on a few key exports like bauxite and tourism. The 1970s and 80s were particularly brutal, with economic turbulence that sent shockwaves through every sector of society. But here's what makes Jamaica's current moment so extraordinary. Over the past decade, something shifted. The nation began a systematic transformation of its economic fundamentals. Debt-to-GDP ratio, once among the highest in the world at over 140%, has been steadily declining through disciplined fiscal management. Credit ratings have improved. Investment in infrastructure has accelerated. And perhaps most importantly, a new generation of Jamaican leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators have decided that the old narrative no longer serves them. What catalysts are powering this audacious ambition? It starts with a fundamental realization that the world is changing, and the rules that made Singapore successful in the 20th century might not be the same rules that define success in the 21st. Jamaica isn't trying to become Singapore. It's trying to become the best version of itself, and in doing so, it's discovering advantages that even the most successful nations envy. Now, let's talk about Singapore. And let me be clear, Singapore is an extraordinary success story. In just 6 decades, Lee Kuan Yew and his successors transformed a resource-poor island into one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. It became the gold standard for economic development, a shining example of what visionary leadership and strategic planning can achieve. But every model has its limitations, and every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, has its vulnerabilities. Beyond the glossy exterior of Marina Bay Sands and Changi Airport lies a more complex reality. Singapore's population is aging rapidly, and it's aging faster than almost any other developed nation. By 2030, 1 in 4 Singaporeans will be over 65 years old. This demographic time bomb creates enormous pressure on the economy, healthcare systems, and workforce productivity. Singapore has tried to address this through immigration, but that strategy comes with its own social tensions and integration challenges. Then there's the issue of economic concentration. Singapore's success has been built on a few key pillars: finance, trade, manufacturing, and more recently, tech. But this concentration creates vulnerability. When global shipping patterns shift, when financial regulations change, or when manufacturing moves to cheaper locations, Singapore feels it acutely. The nation has positioned itself as indispensable, but in a rapidly changing world, nothing remains indispensable forever. Let's talk about the price of perfection. Singapore consistently ranks as one of the most expensive cities in the world. Housing costs are astronomical. The pressure to succeed, to maintain the economic miracle, creates a society that, while prosperous, can feel suffocating. Young Singaporeans increasingly talk about emigration, about finding breathing room, about escaping the relentless competition and pressure. Innovation, the kind of wild, disruptive innovation that creates entirely new industries, often requires the freedom to fail, to experiment, to take risks that don't make immediate economic sense. Can that kind of innovation truly thrive in an environment of such carefully managed perfection? And then there are the global shifts that could reshape everything. The rise of China has already altered trade dynamics in Southeast Asia. New economic blocs are forming. ASEAN nations are strengthening ties in ways that could reduce Singapore's role as the essential middleman. The Belt and Road Initiative, conflicts in the South China Sea, changing relationships between the U.S. and China, all of these create uncertainty for a nation whose entire model depends on stability and being the trusted neutral ground for global business. Singapore isn't collapsing, far from it. But the question isn't whether Singapore will fail. The question is whether its model of growth can be sustained at the same rate, and whether the factors that made it unbeatable in the past will continue to provide the same advantages in the future. And that's where Jamaica's opportunity emerges. Here's where the story gets really interesting. When people think of Jamaica, they think tourism, beaches, and Bob Marley. And yes, tourism is important, contributing significantly to the economy. But what's happening beyond the resorts and reggae festivals is nothing short of revolutionary. Let's start with technology. Jamaica has been quietly building a robust business process outsourcing sector that now employs tens of thousands of people and generates hundreds of millions in revenue. Companies around the world are discovering that Jamaica offers a unique combination: English-speaking, highly trainable workforce, favorable time zones for serving North American markets, and significantly lower costs than developed nations. But it goes deeper than call centers. Jamaica is developing software development capabilities, fintech innovation, and digital creative industries. The island's tech community is small but growing rapidly, with increasing numbers of young Jamaicans choosing coding over traditional career paths. Renewable energy represents another frontier. Jamaica has been heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels, which has kept energy costs high and created economic vulnerability. But the island is blessed with abundant sunshine, strong trade winds, and geothermal potential. The government has set ambitious renewable energy targets, and private investment is flowing in. Imagine an economy powered primarily by renewable energy within the next 15 years. That's not fantasy. That's the trajectory Jamaica is on. This transformation won't just reduce costs. It positions Jamaica as a leader in the green economy, attracting investment and expertise from around the world. The creative industries are where Jamaica's influence already punches far above its weight. Reggae, dancehall, Jamaican cuisine, athletic achievement. These cultural exports have global resonance that money can't buy. But Jamaica is learning to better monetize this cultural capital. Music production, film, fashion, digital content creation. These sectors are growing, creating jobs, and building Jamaica's brand in ways that traditional industries never could. When a small island nation has cultural influence that rivals countries 100 times its size, that's an asset that deserves serious strategic attention. Now let's talk about something truly powerful: the Jamaican diaspora. There are more people of Jamaican descent living outside Jamaica than inside it. These millions of people, scattered across the United States, Canada, the UK, and elsewhere, maintain deep connections to the island. They send remittances that exceed tourism revenues. They invest in businesses. They advocate for Jamaica on global stages. But increasingly, there's a new phenomenon. Diaspora professionals with skills, capital, and networks are returning, either physically or through remote work arrangements, bringing global expertise back to Jamaica. This brain gain, combined with strategic partnerships with diaspora communities, creates a multiplier effect that most nations can only dream of achieving. Policy shifts are accelerating these trends. The Jamaican government has recognized that the old playbook isn't sufficient. There's been increased focus on education reform, particularly in STEM fields. Investment in digital infrastructure is expanding broadband access across the island. Tax incentives for strategic sectors are attracting foreign direct investment. Special economic zones are being developed to create hubs of innovation and manufacturing. And critically, there's growing emphasis on ease of doing business, reducing bureaucracy, and creating an environment where entrepreneurs can thrive. Infrastructure upgrades are visible across the island. New highways are connecting regions that were previously isolated. The logistics sector is being modernized, with Kingston's port receiving upgrades to handle larger vessels and increased cargo volume. The airport infrastructure is expanding. These aren't glamorous investments, but they're foundational. They're the unglamorous work that makes everything else possible. Perhaps most importantly, there's investment in human capital. Jamaica has always produced talent that excels on global stages, from athletes to musicians to academics. But too often, that talent left and never returned because the opportunities at home weren't sufficient. That's changing. Scholarships are increasing. Vocational training is being aligned with market needs. There's a growing recognition that Jamaica's greatest resource isn't bauxite or beaches, it's people. And when you invest in people, when you give them the tools, education, and opportunities to excel, the returns are exponential. So what does it actually mean for Jamaica to surpass Singapore by 2040? We need to be specific, because this isn't about rhetoric, it's about measurable transformation. Let's break down the key metrics and what success would actually look like. GDP per capita is the obvious starting point. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita is roughly $72,000, while Jamaica's sits around $5,500. That's a massive gap, seemingly insurmountable. But here's what most people miss. We're not talking about absolute numbers. We're talking about trajectory and rate of growth. If Jamaica can sustain annual GDP per capita growth of 7 to 8%, while Singapore's growth slows to 2 to 3% due to the demographic and structural challenges we discussed, the math starts to look very different over 15 years. Compound growth is powerful. It's not about Jamaica reaching Singapore's current level. It's about Jamaica's growth trajectory creating momentum that positions it as the emerging powerhouse, while Singapore's growth plateaus. But GDP per capita alone is insufficient. Let's talk about the innovation index. Singapore consistently ranks in the top tier globally for innovation. Jamaica currently doesn't. But innovation isn't just about patents and R&D spending, though those matter. It's about creating an ecosystem where new ideas can flourish, where entrepreneurship is celebrated, where failure is seen as a learning opportunity rather than a stigma. Jamaica's creative culture, its history of producing outsized influence in music and sports, suggests a population with inherent innovation capabilities. The question is whether institutions and infrastructure can channel that creativity into economic innovation. Early signs are promising. Tech startups are emerging. Social entrepreneurship is gaining traction. Youth engagement in problem-solving is increasing. Human development is where Jamaica already shows surprising strength. Despite economic challenges, Jamaica's literacy rate is high, over 88%. Healthcare, while underfunded, has produced health outcomes better than many nations at similar income levels. The question isn't whether Jamaica can develop its people. It's whether it can create economic opportunities that match that human development. That's the gap being addressed through strategic sector development. Now, comparative advantages. This is where Jamaica's unique attributes become crucial. Let's start with natural resources. Jamaica has significant bauxite reserves. Yes, but more importantly, it has renewable energy potential that could transform it into an energy exporter rather than importer. Imagine Jamaica selling clean energy to neighboring Caribbean nations. That's not science fiction. That's strategic planning already underway. Cultural influence is an advantage that can't be manufactured. Singapore has economic might, but Jamaica has cultural magnetism. In an increasingly connected world where brand, perception, and soft power matter enormously, Jamaica starts with recognition and goodwill that took Singapore decades to build through expensive campaigns. Everyone knows Jamaica. The question is whether Jamaica can convert that recognition into economic leverage. Strategic location is another underappreciated advantage. Jamaica sits at the crossroads of major shipping lanes between North and South America, between the Atlantic and the Pacific via the Panama Canal. As nearshoring accelerates, as companies look for alternatives to Asian manufacturing, Jamaica's proximity to the massive North American market becomes increasingly valuable. 3-hour flight times to major U.S. cities matter. Same time zones matter. Cultural familiarity matters. Let's address the challenges because acknowledging them is crucial to overcoming them. Crime remains a significant issue, with homicide rates that hurt Jamaica's international image and create real costs for business and society. But there's growing recognition that crime is fundamentally an economic and social issue, not just a law enforcement problem. When you create economic opportunities, when you invest in communities, when you give young people alternatives to informal economies, crime rates decline. It's happening in specific parishes where targeted interventions are showing results. It needs to scale. Climate change poses an existential threat to all Caribbean nations. Rising sea levels, more intense hurricanes, changing weather patterns, these aren't abstract future concerns. They're present realities. But here's where challenge becomes opportunity. Jamaica can become a laboratory for climate resilience, for sustainable development, for green building and renewable infrastructure. The nations that solve these challenges won't just survive. They'll lead, exporting solutions to the rest of the world facing the same threats. Education gaps, particularly in STEM and technical fields, remain. But the solution is already being implemented. Partnerships with international universities, online education platforms, vocational training programs aligned with industry needs. These are closing the gap faster than traditional educational reform ever could. When you combine these formal efforts with the informal knowledge transfer happening through diaspora engagement, you get rapid skill development. Let's zoom out and think about what Jamaica's success would mean beyond its shores. If Jamaica achieves even half of this ambitious vision, the implications ripple far beyond one small island nation. The Caribbean has been written off too many times, seen as tourist destinations, tax havens, or economic afterthoughts. But what if Jamaica becomes the proof of concept that rewrites that narrative? A successful Jamaica becomes a magnet and a model for the entire region. Trinidad, Barbados, the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, all of these nations face similar challenges and opportunities. If Jamaica demonstrates that it's possible to break through, to achieve developed nation status within a generation, to build prosperity that's sustainable and inclusive, then suddenly, the entire Caribbean becomes a region of possibility rather than limitation. This isn't zero-sum. Jamaica's success doesn't require other nations to fail. In fact, it creates networks, trade relationships, and regional integration that benefit everyone. Imagine a Caribbean economic bloc that rivals ASEAN in influence, a grouping of nations that negotiates collectively, that creates a unified market of tens of millions of consumers, that attracts investment as a region rather than as isolated small economies. Jamaica could be the catalyst for that transformation. Beyond the Caribbean, Jamaica's story offers lessons for developing nations everywhere. The traditional development playbook, the one written by institutions in Washington and Brussels, hasn't always delivered results. Too often, it's been about austerity, about opening markets without building capacity, about following templates that worked elsewhere without adapting to local realities. If Jamaica succeeds by leveraging its unique advantages, by investing in its people, by building on its cultural strengths rather than trying to become a cheap copy of Singapore or Hong Kong or Dubai, then it demonstrates an alternative path. This is a model of development that's sustainable not because it follows all the environmental checkboxes, though that matters, but because it's rooted in what makes Jamaica distinctly Jamaican. It's inclusive not because of wealth redistribution programs, though those have their place, but because the growth sectors, technology, creative industries, green energy, are accessible to ordinary people with talent and drive, not just those born into privilege. So let's ask the ultimate question. Is this a pipe dream or a plausible reality? The honest answer is, it depends. It depends on sustained political will across multiple election cycles. It depends on continued investment in the fundamentals, education, infrastructure, institutions. It depends on Jamaica's ability to navigate global economic turbulence, climate threats, and competitive pressures from other emerging economies. But here's what we know for certain. Jamaica has assets that most developing nations don't. A diaspora that's engaged and increasingly interested in contributing. A cultural brand that's recognized globally. A strategic location that's becoming more valuable, not less. A young population that's increasingly educated and connected. A government that, for all its flaws, has shown it can implement difficult reforms and maintain macroeconomic stability. The path from where Jamaica is today to surpassing Singapore by 2040 is steep. It requires sustained growth rates that few nations achieve. It requires navigating challenges that could derail progress. But is it impossible? Absolutely not. Is it improbable? Perhaps. But remember, 50 years ago, Singapore's success seemed improbable too. 60 years ago, South Korea was poorer than many African nations. 30 years ago, China was considered a cheap manufacturing base, not an economic superpower. Economic transformation happens faster than we expect when the right conditions align. When a nation is hungry, when it has leadership that thinks strategically, when global conditions create opportunities, and when a population believes that a better future is achievable, momentum builds. And momentum, once established, can be self-reinforcing. Success attracts investment. Investment creates opportunities. Opportunities attract talent. Talent drives innovation. Innovation creates success. The cycle builds on itself. Jamaica is at an inflection point. The next 15 years will determine whether this ambitious vision becomes reality or remains an inspiring but unfulfilled aspiration. But one thing is certain. The narrative is changing. Jamaica is no longer content to be defined by its past or limited by others' expectations. It's writing its own story, and that story is about transformation, about resilience, about refusing to accept that small nations must remain small economically. So whether Jamaica surpasses Singapore by 2040 or not, the mere fact that we can have this conversation seriously, that we can map out a plausible pathway, that we can see the building blocks falling into place, that itself represents a monumental shift. And for everyone who believes that economic destiny isn't fixed, that nations can reinvent themselves, that the underdog can rise, Jamaica's journey over the next 15 years will be absolutely fascinating to watch. The revolution is quiet, but it's real. And if Jamaica succeeds, it won't just transform one island. It will transform what we believe is possible for nations everywhere that refuse to accept limitations. That's a story worth following, worth supporting, and worth believing in. Jamaica's incredible comeback isn't just about economics. It's about redefining what's achievable when vision meets determination. And that's something that resonates far beyond GDP statistics and innovation rankings. That's about human potential unleashed. And there's nothing more powerful than that.